Session 7B, SupTech and RegTech, creating more transparent tech and data-driven approaches for supervisors and regulators. I will let our moderator explain a little bit what are the questions we're going to explore, what is it all about. But you notice that the format has changed. This is a so-called fishbowl. So we have actually supposed to have 3 fishes plus from moderating fish, and the rest are the bowl. You are the bowl. So the format is very similar to what you have seen, just the setting has changed. Our moderator will ask some introductory questions to our panelists, but approximately after half time, we're going to open the inner circle for you as participants to engage. There are 2 empty chairs, at the moment 3, but 2 empty chairs. And if you want to join the conversation by a question or a short comment, please do so. And you can do that not by sitting in the outer circle. You have to get up, sit down, and actually say your piece. Okay? If you ask a question, of course, you wait until the answer is given. Once this is done, it might be even 2 times quickly, like a mini conversation, you get up and vacate, that other people can join. In the case that there are too many people getting up at the same time, we have a kind of traffic jam, a concept people in Manila are very familiar with, or our colleagues from Jakarta, or Kuala Lumpur, or Bangkok, then you just can wait, yeah? But usually you will see it will be a natural flow, okay? So as I said, this is also a chance to make a short comment, but don't take it as a chance to give a 10-minute presentation. Yeah? So be mindful that other people want to engage. You can ask all the questions you want to ask. Yeah? So I will check now one more time for Peter Lovelock, but maybe let me introduce you already to your moderator. And this time I have to actually use the app because I misplaced the paper. So this is our moderator. He's actually the Carey Holdings Professor in Law at the University of Hong Kong. He's also a senior fellow at the Melbourne Law School, University of Melbourne, and a non-executive director of Upterum Group. Maybe you can explain what this group does. Biotech. Or might not. So please give a warm welcome to Douglas Arner. Now we use the mic.
Thanks very much, Joost, and thanks everyone for joining this afternoon. I think we have a very good panel with us, even excluding the one who isn't here yet. And also, hopefully, with this format, we will get the involvement of quite a number of you from the audience as well. And so we've allowed quite a bit of time for discussions. And, honestly, to test out the format, feel free, even if you just want to come up and sit for a while and you don't have anything, just to do so. I think we have these 2 open chairs. We're saving the 3rd one for our 3rd speaker. My name, as Joost said, is Douglas Arner. I specialize in financial regulation. I've worked in most areas of fintech. I work a lot with the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, and a range of others, and we'll talk about some of these issues. I'm joined by Joanne Horgan. Joanne is Chief Innovation Officer at Visor, and by Youngtae Kim. Youngtae is the Deputy Director General of the FinTech Coordination Team at the FinTech Innovation Office of the Financial Supervisory Services of Korea. Excellent. And just in time to be introduced, our 3rd panelist, Peter Rosenkrantz. Peter is an economist with the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department of ADB. And essentially, what we're going to be talking about today are 2 things that I find very exciting. RegTech and what I would define as one portion of RegTech, which is SupTech or supervisory technology, and partnerships between both the private sector and the public sector in the area of designing better financial systems. And so, what I think we're going to try to do is try to investigate this term. What does RegTech mean? then we're going to come to some of the questions. What sorts of issues is it trying to solve from the industry standpoint? But today, given our audience, we're going to be focusing much more specifically on the official sector. What sorts of things are we trying to solve for with technology from the standpoint of central banks and financial regulators, both from the standpoint of improving financial regulatory objectives as well as enhancing broader objectives such as economic growth, financial inclusion, and the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we'll start with is just a brief introduction from each of our panelists about what they're doing. And then we'll turn to this question of what is RegTech and SupTech before moving to some questions around the trends and the issues that we see and some specific case studies from a range of different countries. And from that, I suspect that we'll then be ready to open it up for any of you who we would very much welcome to come join us in these discussions. As we get started, I'm going to take the opportunity to pass around something that we just published called the RegTech book that you can take a look at during the break, in which we'll give, well, not during the break, but across the date, which will give some other views on some of these topics. So, if maybe we could start, Yongtae. Yeah. So, just a bit about yourself, your institution, and what you're doing.
Thank you. First time in my life, I'm in the fishbowl. So, I'm not afraid because there's no baby shark in their family. Anyway, I'm directly involved in the development of SupTech in the FSS of Korea. So I'm not in charge of international affairs or something. So I'd like to share my experience in developing the SupTech system. Firstly, I want to mention the definition of SupTech and RegTech.
Let's just do the introductions, and we'll then come to the specifics.
First speak.
So, Peter, who are you? What are you doing? Who are you working for?
So I'm Peter Rosenkrantz from ADB. I work for the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department in the Regional Cooperation Integration Division. My work primarily relates to financial stability, integration, development, and that relates to knowledge work in general, but also, of course, to ADB support to policy forums such as ASEAN, ASEAN +3, APEC, ASEM, just to name a few.
Excellent. And Joanne, coming from a different, the private sector as opposed to the public sector.
Yeah, different background. So I'm Joanne Horgan. I'm Chief Innovation Officer at Visor Software. Visor is the global leader in SupTech for data collection and analytics. So we work in about 30 countries with regulators, both developing nations in Africa, for example, and also with some of the larger regulators like MAS, APRA, Bank of England, Bank of Canada. So yeah, I think I'll have quite some views on SupTech, and yeah, I'm looking forward to this.
Very good. So we have with us someone who is basically working on their own strategies. We have someone who is basically working with public sector institutions in trying to develop technologies to address those pain points, and then someone from the policy perspective who is looking at sort of broader sort of lessons and issues across this space. And so, sort of turning from that, let's start with this question of what is RegTech, and maybe we'll pass this one to Peter first.
Okay, so basically let's just quickly maybe take one step back first and then define RegTech and SupTech. So basically, of course, we as ADB strongly believe in the benefits of technology for promoting financial sector development, financial inclusion, financial efficiency that really provides a lot of opportunities. For example, in Asia, we have still 1 billion of people without formal bank access. At the same time, technological advances are progressing. So there's huge opportunities, for example, for providing finance to rural areas, for example, to providing finance to those MSMEs who are otherwise excluded. At the same time, without going into detail too much into that topic, there are huge opportunities, but also huge challenges. And those challenges are often relating to striking the right balance between financial innovation, that is providing a enabling environment for innovators, to provide incentives for innovation, to provide them the space to, grow and have the right scope so that they can offer their services. At the same time, also striking the balance of financial stability from the policy perspective, along, of course, with considerations of data privacy, consumer protections, KYC, AML, and the like. And there, I think RegTech and SupTech really comes into play. So RegTech would be the application of technology for complying with regulatory requirements that can be done from financial institutions or through other service providers to those financial institutions, whereas SupTech, in a way, relates to the application of technology for supervisors themselves. Of course, one cannot really look at those in isolation. I very much like the one slide by Mr. Kim. Probably we'll talk more about it later. So we really look at it in terms of an ecosystem. So you have fintech companies, you have RegTech, you have SupTech, but of course nothing can be looked at in isolation. So there's an interplay. And if you think about, for instance, harmonization, data harmonization, a big issue here, doesn't make sense if the regulatory requirements or let's say RegTech uses that template, just speaking practically, supervisors a different one. So there needs to be a dialogue between all stakeholders, which is very important. And that's, of course, also where ADB comes a bit into play. So our role is also to foster regional cooperation, to foster dialogue, to bring together all stakeholders through knowledge sharing, but also to fostering policy dialogue and policy initiatives, for example, at policy forums, such as mentioned before, ASEAN +3, just to name, for example, the ASEAN Bond Market Forum, where topics relating to this are heavily discussed.
Yeah, and I guess from the ADB standpoint, at the sort of regional level, are we seeing are you working on a variety of regional initiatives in this area? What sorts of things are you looking at?
One example I'd like to mention here is, again, this ASEAN +3 Bond Market Forum, ABMF. There's a number of initiatives going on, but one which we believe is important is, let's say, indirectly related to RegTech and SupTech, but still likewise very important, which is data standardization. So that is actually a global initiative to have a common data standard for payment messages or payment and settlement messages. It's the ISO 20022 standard. And also ASEAN is really taking in big steps, so all major market infrastructures also apply this standard ultimately, and that I would call an enabling factor. So once you have the data standardization, especially for cross-border payments, then you can really leverage the benefits of technology through, for example, big data applications, through AI, through machine learning. Of course, if you don't have that standardization, especially cross-border payments, that's a bit tricky. I'm sure, my panel colleagues, they can share a bit more on that. So that's one initiative we very specifically support. Of course, we also support APEC Forum on various occasions, but that also touches often digitization, technology, not necessarily RegTech and SupTech in particular, to that same extent than the ASEAN.
Yeah, I think you've highlighted a bunch of issues, and certainly we saw this when we were doing the study of putting together the RegTech book and the related project. That basically there's this, we have these terms, RegTech and SupTech, but really, when you think of RegTech, it involves the use of technology for compliance, but also for regulation and systems design. Because after all, you can't really have RegTech without supervisors. After all, if you're not trying to comply with some rule, then it doesn't exist. And of course, the firms, we may call them RegTechs, but then they're selling to both central banks as well as to the private sector. And you call them something different depending on what your client is. And I think we're seeing very much that increasingly the trend is exactly what Peter says. How can we come up with standardized systems which enable public sector authorities to do a better job at achieving their objectives, whether that's financial stability, market integrity, financial inclusion, or achieving the Sustainable Development Goals? How can we build better systems, and how can then we engage with the private sector in helping to apply those systems? And I think this one, if I think of, Joanne, from the standpoint of your business, how have you seen this area evolving, and what sorts of trends do you see?
Sure. I mean, I think, I really liked what Peter said there about standardization, because one thing that we see, we're a technology company, obviously in the private sector, but I think sometimes there's a bit of a leap towards the buzzwords in technology. So let's look at AI, let's look at big data, let's do this, let's do that. You can't really do any of that unless you have, good quality data in a standardized format first, and good data governance, good data modeling, all those types of things. So I think we've probably seen maybe an acceptance of that people really need to start with, what is the data we want to collect, what's the purpose we want to use it for, and a move away from maybe, from our point of view, we see a move away from maybe high-level aggregated data into more granular data being used by supervisors. So going away from, I guess, that first, when we started, our company's in operation about 15 years. When we started, we were really at that first stage of getting regulators maybe off paper, right? So going away from paper, let's use, online forms, and let's use Excel, and let's apply maybe data validation rules. Then we saw the move towards, let's have online portals, but let's now allow XBRL, XML, different formats, different standards, ISO 2022, for example, and then applying analytics on top of that. So dashboards, etc. And I think now what we're seeing is people really want to move to that next stage of using AI on data as it comes in. So let's not wait and have a big data analytics. You can do AI and machine learning, 2 months, 3 months down the line, but what about using it up front during the data collection process? So, if you have a system where you have standardized data, where you've applied some rules as the data is coming in that are predefined, but then allow machine learning, for example, to look at the data as it comes in, use the trained data set that it has, and start to maybe highlight to supervisors, maybe you should take a closer look at this. Because one of the key things we see is the speed that everything moves at now has increased. It's, again, years ago it was fine for regulators to change their systems once a year, then it became every quarter. Now there's surveys that people want to do tomorrow. So I think there's a change in sort of the speed that people and regulators need to react at. There's an increase in the data volume, the variety of data that needs to be collected. And I think standardization is really going to play an important part in that.
Yeah, I think you have hit some incredibly important points, and it's really about a process of digitizing data collection from the standpoint of central banks and financial regulators, and thinking about how you can design a system from the beginning so that you are better collecting data, so that you can more easily apply analytics to that data, so that you can better achieve whatever your regulatory objectives may be. And I wanted to come back and ask you a bit more about what you're seeing in the terms of granularity of data requests from central banks and the like.
Yeah, so I think in Europe, obviously we have AnaCredit, which is loan level data. I think we're seeing more granular data such as that being required. We did an interesting example in Canada, for example, where they were collecting loan level data. Now they did it in a sort of a bit of a ad hoc way, because it was one of these sort of last minute requests, and collected the data, and they decided to go and collect it in Excel, for example, right? And let's just put out Excel and get, it wasn't huge volume of data, but it was quite granular. And then they spent maybe 3 to 6 months trying to clean up that data and use it, right? Because again, thinking of system design, there's a balance between speed, or maybe that's a trade-off people have thought they needed to make in the past, is the speed, I want to get something out, so I'll just email an Excel to somebody. and not thinking about, well, that's then going to put a huge burden on us as regulators to use that data. But what they did find, I think, from that granular data example that they did was they were able to use that data and give insights back to the industry. So this was looking at loans in the property sector, for example, and they were able to go back to industry and in a sort of not breaching any confidentiality, they were able to go to a particular bank and say, you seem to have a particularly high exposure of loans of these type to foreign individuals, which is not common in the rest of the peer group. And I think maybe, using granular data, a regulator can get a much better view of the entire ecosystem, and they can give more insights back to financial institutions. So I think one of the key things we hear from financial institutions is regulatory compliance is just a burden, just a cost. There's no benefit to us. So why should we do it? Why does it cost us so much? And I'm not saying the regulator's place is to help reduce, but I think there is a place to help reduce that cost, because if we really want to increase financial inclusion, for example, get more people in the market, it can't cost as much as it costs today. So I think there's a lot of potential there with granular data, for example, to use it not only for regulatory and supervisory purposes, but maybe to start giving back some insights and more detailed insights to the industry as well.
Yeah, I think we're seeing this, in the developed markets. You can think of the SEC in the US, the Edgar system. You can think of the impact of the MiFID rules in the EU. But it's also hugely important, we're finding, in the developing country context, where we are having, in an increasing range of cases, very rapid digital financial transformation. And often an impact of that is having new tech companies that are often involved in, say, high volume payment transactions. So imagine that you are the central Bank of China, and the majority of your individual payments go through Alipay and WeChat Pay, but from the standpoint of achieving your mandate of macroeconomic growth, monetary stability, what you're lacking is actually visibility of the majority of payment transactions in the economy. And so from the standpoint of a developing country, as Joanne mentions, when you get changes, when you are having leapfrogging, what it means is that often you need to have access to new forms of data that you haven't previously accessed. And thinking about those new forms of data is an appropriate time to think about how can you design the systems of collecting that data so that it's most efficient for the industry. And of course, many tech firms are building automated systems for compliance, but also how can that data be most useful for you from the standpoint of a supervisor. Now, I'll come back to all of the panelists in just a minute and ask some questions about how you actually go about modernizing data systems within central banks and regulatory agencies. But I think now is a really good time to turn over and hear from Yong-Tae. As a supervisor, what are you all actually trying to do? And in particular, why are you trying to do it?
In order to the efficiency of and effectiveness of RegTech and SupTech is already well known. So in Korea, the RegTech will transform regulatory compliance and risk management and financial institutions, while SupTech will increase supervisory efficiency and effectiveness. And there are many areas that RegTech and SupTech can contribute, such as reporting, as you mentioned, the automated reporting and real-time monitoring, and data management, and market surveillance, misconduct analysis, micro and macro prudential. But there are many benefits, but I'd like to mention there are other challenges encountered in implementation process, because I am involved in the development of SupTech. So I think there are four main challenges to activate RegTech and SupTech. Those are cost, reliability, and data security, and mindset. There are possibility to incur significant development cost, as well as the ongoing maintenance cost to financial institutions and regulators. Cost-benefit analysis is needed before the actual development developing. And secondly, liability attached to the erroneous data submission as a result of the use of such a RegTech solution. Regulator exploring this type of RegTech solution may be advised to give some consideration on how to manage potential fallout of erroneous code instance. And thirdly, a larger store of data, it becomes increasingly important. I mean, the difficult to ensure the resilient system are in place to safeguard information. And lastly, mindset. I'm currently involved in SupTech development in the FSS, and I'd like to share my experience. When I started the AI-based pilot system to review the terms and conditions of a finance instrument is AI-based. I have a lot of difficulty to persuade step in charge to join the project, I mean, inside our organization. For example, mis-selling is a very important supervision target. When I demonstrate voice recognition technology, there was a staff who asked me if I was from outer space, and are you alien or like this? They have no concept